Aloha and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the third session of the US-Singapore Tech and Innovation Virtual Dialogue, Forging Digital Standards, Challenges in Intellectual Property and Supply Chains. My name is Crystal Pryor, and I'm Vice President of the Pacific Forum. Pacific Forum's US-Singapore Tech and Innovation Virtual Dialogue is a 6-part online series plus digital publication that examines the collaborative partnership between the United States and Singapore in fostering digital innovation and resilience in Southeast Asia. This series emphasizes the US and Singapore's central role in driving technological innovation in the region against the backdrop of great power competition in the post-COVID-19 era. Participants will reflect on existing developments in digital innovation and nascent areas that are ripe for collaboration. The series will also encourage creative and critical thinking to identify other unexpected disruptors for future collaboration. By the end of the series, we hope that participants will have a better grasp on how the US and Singapore can spur digital growth through improved policy coordination that facilitates practical engagements on the exchange of talent, data, expertise, technology, and best practices, which will have positive flow-on effects in the region. Session 2, Making the Digital Leap, Innovation and Transformation, held in November, explored how the US and Singapore can lead digital innovation and transformation in the region in fields such as e-commerce and manufacturing. It especially focused on how digital transformation positively affects these industries while highlighting the concrete challenges faced, especially among micro, small, and medium enterprises. If you missed our previous sessions, you can find links to the event pages with the key findings and video recordings in the chat box now. Now let's take a look at the results from the poll that ran as you all joined the session. So the question was, how confident are you in your government's ability to thwart hackers and cyber attacks? Nobody said very confident. 41% of people said fairly confident, and 59% of people said not very confident. So no one also said not confident at all. So there's some confidence, but no one's totally confident or totally not confident about it. So let's get a little more deep into these questions as we go on today's session. Close that. So today's session of the US-Singapore Tech and Innovation Virtual Dialogue, Forging Digital Standards, Challenges in Intellectual Property and Supply Chains, will tackle how the high-tech sector and other industries can protect their sensitive data and intellectual property from malicious actors. With overtures of decoupling reverberating across the region, this session will explore best practices and standards adopted by the US and Singapore in strengthening their cyber defenses and resiliency across technical, policy, and cognitive dimensions from potential cyber-enabled intellectual property theft. Our speakers will share insights on ways to protect intellectual property while managing cyber supply chain risks. Please note that remarks made in today's program are on the record, and a video recording of this session will be made available to the Pacific Forum website and social media in the future. This event is also being live streamed to Facebook. Benjamin Ang, Senior Fellow and Deputy Head of the Center of Excellence for National Security at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, will moderate the discussion, which will include feedback and Q&A with the audience. Participants will be allowed to unmute their mics to ask questions or give feedback, but cameras are disabled throughout the session. We also have other interactive features like polling as we go along, and here is today's second poll. Question is, will the pace of technological decoupling between the United States and China increase or decrease in the future? The options are increase, decrease, or if you think there'll be no change in the current pace. While we're waiting on those poll results, I'll note we also have a survey we'd like you to complete after the event concludes. This will become available on our series website near the end of the event. You can view this in the series event website at the link shared in the chat box now. So let's take a look at the poll results. So the majority of people actually, 3/4 of the people think that the pace is actually going to increase in decoupling but 1/5 of the people said decrease, and then 7% said no change. So we can also broach this topic as we get on with the webinar today. Okay, so now to today's session. I'll hand the mic over to Benjamin Ang to take it from here. Ben?
Thank you very much, Crystal, and thanks for inviting me to moderate this. Since I was going to attend anyway, I'm glad to now have the opportunity to corner Andreas and Priya for more questions. So as you heard, there are 2 speaker presentations today, followed by a Q&A. And this is a friendly reminder for the speakers to keep the presentation to 15 minutes max, so that we can have enough time for Q&A. And the total session time will be 90 minutes. So for Andreas and Priya, I know you can get very caught up in the presentations or the talking. So if you don't see the timer, I'll just clear my throat loudly when you have about a minute to go. And if you really hear me clearing my throat a lot, you might have gone over time. But please don't worry, because we'll have time to go into more detail in the Q&A. And for participants, you may raise your hand, meaning raise your hand using the raise hand button, not raise your hand physically because I can't see you. Use the raise hand button. Or submit your questions in the Q&A box, even better. If you want to unmute yourself, let us know. If you want to submit in the Q&A box, let us know. If you want to be anonymous, let us know. And you can do it anytime while they are speaking. You don't have to wait till the end. But I'll only get to your questions at the end. So today's presenters for our first session on forging digital standards, challenges in intellectual property and supply chains are Andreas Kuhn, Senior Fellow at Observer Research Foundation America, and Priya Mahajan, Head of Asia Pacific Public Policy and Regulatory Council at Verizon Enterprise Solutions. So first, I'd like to introduce Andreas, who's a Senior Fellow at the Observer Research Foundation America, where he leads research on international cybersecurity cooperation within ORF America's Cyberspace Cooperation Initiative, and focuses on new risks and challenges in international security at the intersection of emerging technology, cybersecurity, and technology governance. You will want to read his report on weathering tech nationalism, security, and trustworthiness framework to manage cybersecurity supply chain risk, because in there he examines trustworthiness and security in global ICT supply chains. Lots of other interesting things you can find out. And prior to this, he was a senior program associate at East West Institute, where he led the development of EWI's breakthrough group efforts and worked on US, Russia, and US-China cybersecurity issues. So he's definitely the right person to hear from. Over to you, Andreas.
Ben, thank you so much for the very kind introduction, and it's a pleasure for me to be here today. Thank you, Crystal, for inviting me and for your team to make this possible, as well as for the US Embassy in Singapore to support this event. I'm really happy to be here. So today's talk, I'd love to talk about, as Ben said, supply chains. And particularly because I think they're really important to understand as they pertain to protecting intellectual property, but the range of other issues that are important to cybersecurity. Supply chain security is at the heart of this question. And so I think I just want to get started to give you an overview about supply chain security efforts that are currently underway and some of the challenges that we're facing, as well as how we can overcome them. So let's get started with why supply chains are important and why we should pay attention to them and their security. There are 2 ways to think about it. So one is the use of third-party products and services come with risks, and we need to understand those risks in order to mitigate them. It's a kind of a classical cybersecurity task. But the other way to think about supply chain security is, and that's why I like to do, and I think it's also the more interesting one, is to recognize the strategic nature of ICT for the economy, national security, and the digital transformation. And it also addresses the domestic reliance on foreign suppliers for critical technology and the potential for adversaries to exploit such dependencies or security vulnerabilities in the technology. As a result, supply chain security has become an important topic, with a wide range of standards and frameworks being developed to that end, so we can have tools available to deal with digital and supply chain security. But in addition to those more technical and organizational cybersecurity measures, states have implemented or are at least considering more restrictive measures that belong in some form of a different category. And Ben already mentioned this 2020 report on technology nationalism, which kind of looks into government policies and actions that favor ICT products and services sold by domestic companies over those provided by companies headquartered in states seen as competitors or adversaries. And examples of such measures include requiring companies to localize data, subjecting foreign companies to enhanced security requirements, such as some form of intrusive but mandatory source code inspection. But also, we have seen them over the past few years, those conversations quite a few times, kind of the banning of specific foreign products or vendors. While some of these measures can be justified based on national security concerns, there's often trade-offs with competing economic interests. Think of the US semiconductor industry, who cannot sell their chips any longer to Chinese tech manufacturers, to impose restrictions, which is a loss of revenue. So, what are the key drivers or factors, and in some cases also the threats that led to these developments? And I know that Priya will talk about this a little bit in more detail, but I just want to give a very quick overview, what I think is important to understand why supply chain security becomes such a big issue. For one, the threat and risk landscape have significantly changed in recent years, and the scale and scope of incidents targeting supply chains are rising. With that comes kind of like the number of bad actors is expanding. The cost to conduct hacking is declining, as cyber criminals become professionalized in conducting their business. But I think the interesting part is also to recognize how the issues around cybersecurity might have been reframed, and that we think more about this now from a supply chain perspective in the first place. And I recently had a fairly interesting conversation with a colleague who observed that, it seems like we're doing a good job, because when attackers have to come through supply chains, that means the front doors are shut and are more secure than they used to be in the past. So I think it's in some sense a good development that we actually are having this conversation about protecting supply chains. Again, this is from a cybersecurity perspective. Another important aspect to this is also to understand that the digital transformation, here I'm thinking about Singapore's Smart Nation Singapore strategy. This digital transformation is increasing the attack vectors for bad guys to do bad things. As more and more devices are connected to critical infrastructure and the internet, it just increases the opportunities for bad guys and also the risk of bad things happening. And then last but not least, the COVID-19 pandemic made us all work from home, and in some sense it also increased or changed the supply chain, if you want, of that needs to be protected when goods are produced or consumed through digital means. But I think the interesting part here, and one of the key driver, is the geopolitics of technologies, particular critical and emerging technologies, including 5G, artificial intelligence, semiconductors, and national security concerns that led to those restrictive measures in the first place, with calls to relocate production, build technology alliances among like-minded states, decoupling technological and economic universes, and so forth. So I think that's kind of like some of those. That's the reason why we're having this conversation in the first place. Before I go further to talk about more how we can actually protect supply chains, let's talk briefly also why it's actually fairly difficult to do that in the first place. And there are 4 factors that come to mind. First, supply chains are fairly complex and difficult to secure. They are globally distributed and global in nature, which makes that job difficult. As an example here, Apple has more than 200 suppliers in 43 countries and 6 continents, and each of them have their own multiple subcontractors. And again, supply chain or the security net can be just as strong as its weakest link, and so this becomes kind of a difficult management task. Second, cybersecurity continues to be just a hard foundational problem that still needs to be solved. Even when you have fairly safe and securely developed software, it can still contain an unintentional exploitable security flaw, which can lead to a breach, could lead to intrusions and the stealing of intellectual property, as an example. As I said before, the third point is that ICT is a strategic asset. The states have recognized that for economic prosperity, but also for military power. And thus, it is at the core of those geopolitical tensions, which makes the point why securing supply chains are difficult. And finally, the fourth point is the fact that imposing accountability for bad behavior is limited. Malicious actors are difficult to deter, are difficult to hold accountable. And anyone who's familiar with some of the conversation at the UN around cyber norms, as well as the conversation around attribution, knows that there is a long way to go until we can actually solve this particular problem. But nevertheless, there is not a lack of trying to overcome those challenges. Just to give you a sense, what the US has been doing in the past few years, cybersecurity or supply chain cybersecurity is a fairly nascent topic still. The NIST has updated its cybersecurity framework to include supply chain security considerations. The last time I've counted, there have been 9 executive offices by the president that directly address supply chain security in different forms. The White House has done a supply chain review to address emerging and critical technologies. The National Security Commission on AI, as well as the Solarium Commission, all kind of dedicated some space and time on supply chain and foreign dependence. And there have been countless efforts in all agencies, particularly DHS, CISA, and NIST, to address supply chain security in form of task forces and so forth. And this excludes, the tremendous amount of work that is being doing in the U.S. defense sector. You might have heard about the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, CMMC, that should help protect the U.S. defense sector with regards to cyber risk. And obviously, mentioned before, the geopolitical tensions that we have seen around the 5G controversy, as well as the buildup of domestic buildup of semiconductor capacities that is currently occurring, kind of provides a large case study on supply chain security in the making. I think 2 key points around that we need to think about when you think about supply chain security is that the what and who. So there is no silver bullet to make supply chain securities more secure. There is not a single measure. There's a wide range of measures that need to be taken to ensure trust. And so the idea is that there's no single one measure that does create sufficient security by itself or trustworthiness, but in combination that can bring us to a higher level of confidence, to a place where the residual risk is manageable at an acceptable level. The idea here is trust must be earned, and trust is achieved through continuous ongoing verification of such measures. The second part is, you might have heard that before, cybersecurity is a team sport. It's a shared responsibility among vendors, operators, and buyers. Everyone has to chip in, as well as the government, particularly in those areas where maybe industry is ill-equipped to do so. And there are kind of like 3 levels of how we can address supply chain security, or at least I like to think along those 3 levels. One is to think about what the buyer or the user of ICT security, of ICT can do in terms of managing risk. And this comes with the procurement requirements they put forth when they buy ICT products or services, such as requiring vendors to follow international standards for security development, ensure that their services and software are delivered in a default secure configuration, and the use of best practices for security vulnerability management. On a second layer, it's kind of the collective layer between buyers as a collective and vendors as a collective. Can ICT buyers leveraging their purchasing power to establish best practices that require ICT vendors to provide, for example, a statement of supply chain risk management, that they should establish some sort of consortium that allows for ICT security assessment. And on the other side, vendors should push for vendor-led assurance and transparency requirements, including their participation in norm-setting efforts, committing themselves to vulnerability disclosure as an industry, adopting specific evaluation accreditation schemes, and so forth. And the third level here at the end is kind of like more on a industry-wide ecosystem level, where we should pursue efforts such as regional transparency centers that allow the efficient review of code, for as one example. But also we think about efforts underway at the United Nations with regards to cyber norms and real multi-stakeholder efforts around supply chain security. I think one example that I wanted to briefly bring up here was the Paris Call for Trust and Security, which I was part of. I will share a link to the report shortly after I'm done with my remarks here. I think there you can see kind of like the huge amount of effort has been put into to compare different efforts underway. And it's quite exciting to see that from a few years ago, where not that much was happening with regards to supply chain security. At this point, we are not short of standards and frameworks to address that. But that brings me kind of like to the last point that I want to make, which is about kind of some of the remaining challenges that we need to address. One is that we have at this point quite a fragmentation of standards and frameworks. There's quite a large number out there, so there needs to be some consolidation happening in the field. But at this point, it's still a very good problem to have, because it shows that there's a lot of engagement from industry, government, and as well as the civil society to actually work on that problem. But that brings me kind of like to the next point. While standards and frameworks are great, we also need to move forward to find ways to implement them. Otherwise, it's just paper, right? And those are important questions with regards to what are the incentives that we have to make sure that those standards are also implemented, and not only by large companies that have the budget for doing that, but also for small organizations, developing countries, less digitally developed states, to actually incorporate that. And then the last point is around accountability. There's still a large conversation that we need to have around industry and taking on accountability for the products that they promote, and taking on good practices and discourages bad behavior in the industry, to make sure users, consumers, organizations have secure and safe software to use. That's the end of my remarks. Thank you, Ben. Back to you.
Thank you, Andreas. Great timing. Hit 15 minutes exactly. And I have a whole bunch of questions to ask you, but of course, I'll leave it till the end. And I invite also anybody else who's got questions to also pile in into the Q&A. So having heard from Andreas, we're very happy to hear next from Priya. Priya is the head of Asia Pacific Public Policy and Regulatory Council, responsible for strategic level policy advice for Verizon's business operations in the Asia Pacific region. And Priya works with internal stakeholders to develop company-wide policy positions for coordinated advocacy strategy aligned with Verizon's global policy approach. And not only that, she's also the president of the Asia Pacific Carriers Coalition, honorary position representing the advocacy interests of global carriers in the Asia region, and co-chair of the AmCham Singapore Cybersecurity Subcommittee and periodic speaker on ICT issues. So as a qualified attorney and company secretary, she's got multiple professional certifications, and we are going to definitely learn a lot from what Priya is going to be presenting next. So over to you, Priya.
Well, thank you so much, Ben, and good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm really excited to be here today to talk about something very interesting, which is the Verizon's data breach investigation report. But before I get started, let me thank the Pacific Forum for the opportunity to speak and share the insights at this US-Singapore Tech and Innovation Dialogue. I know these are really very important conversations, and Verizon is really glad to be a part of this discussion. We have been at the forefront of these discussions, including the much respected and talked about the US-Singapore Joint Cyber Cybersecurity Working Group, a great initiative of the US Embassy Singapore and Cybersecurity Agency Singapore. So really, really excited and glad to be a part of this opportunity today. I have a slide that I'll be showing shortly, but for those of you who do not know Verizon, I thought it would be great for me to just quickly refresh what we do and what are the kind of customers we serve. So we are a global technology company. We operate worldwide with a network footprint in about 150 countries across the globe. Uh, and we have recently launched 5G ultra wideband in the US, bringing the power of 5G very close to our customers. But not only are we providing services in the US, we are pretty much active in the international space. As I said, 150 countries. And what is unique about our international presence is that we do not provide wireless services. We provide enterprise connectivity services to global enterprise customers, which are typically Fortune 100 companies with global ICT solution requirements. And our portfolio is very diverse and rich, including network as a service, advanced communications, and most importantly, security solutions that we provide worldwide to our customers. So with that, let me get started and share my screen. Okay. Thank you. So, so as I said, I would be sharing the Verizon's data breach investigation report today. Moving on to the next slide, we started the data breach investigation report, publishing this report in the year 2007. And what it really does is it answers the who, what, where, why, and how for security incidents and data breaches. And just to help bridge the gap that exist in the intelligence and allowing the organizations to have a more accurate quality and quantity of risk data. And what it really does help is to help organizations predict what the bad actors are likely to do to do next, and then accordingly the organizations can prioritize and implement preventive detection and response effort in a very cost effective manner. So that's really the intent of the data breach investigation report, to provide really actionable insights to our readers on what the threat landscape looks like. So in a nutshell, what is data breach? It is 14 years of our research and intelligence that we've kind of accumulated over the years with contributors from 88 countries. And what we've done is we've looked at about 80,000 plus incidents, out of which about 5,000 are actual data breaches. So that's the extent of the richness of this report, and we provide all this intelligence in the form of an executive summary plus a detailed report on what are the set of recommendations for the readers. So I'll move to the next slide, which talks about the vertical coverage. So what we've tried to do in this report is we've tried to break the report into industry verticals. So we have 15 industry verticals, and since not all the industries are impacted equally in terms of the attack services and threats, so we've tried to break it into the verticals and looked at what industry verticals are in particular targeted by the attackers as and when the attack happens. So based on our investigation, it's the arts and entertainment and recreation industry which is primarily targeted, followed by the public administration, and then information and professional scientific and technical services. And what is also unique about this report is the fact that we've divided it into regional segments. So we have 3 segments in the report, focusing on North America, on Europe, Middle East, and Africa, and then Asia Pacific. For the purpose of today's conversation, I will be focusing more on Asia Pacific and bringing you more insights about what threat landscape looks like in this region. And also, since we are now in the pandemic world, I would also like to kind of highlight that the impact of COVID-19 on the threat landscape, is kind of important and needs to be discussed. And as more and more businesses are adopting digital, we last year we also analyzed what would be the impact of COVID-19 on all these issues. And according to our report, we analyzed that there is an increased phishing, ransomware, and errors as a result of COVID-19, because the threat actors are actually trying to profit from the pandemic. What we found out that while phishing increased 11%, the ransomware increased 6%, and then the use of stolen credentials and publishing errors stayed consistent with the last year. So I think there's definitely a change, and the impact of COVID-19 can be seen on the emerging threat landscape, as the report suggests. So moving forward, now we move to the key insights section, which is more about predicting the future and also scenario planning on what the organizations can prepare themselves for the probable outcome. So the insights from Dbir will really help organization to shape a response strategy, because we are in a very uncertain world, in a very evolving threat landscape. And these insights that we share with you are actually collected from a variety of sources, including our own Verizon's Threat Research Advisory Center, which and we have investigators who continue to work with external collaborators and publicly disclose security incidents. And this data will be evolving, and we continue to engage with new organizations who are willing to share the information to improve the diversity and the coverage of the real events. So with that, let me bring you the key insights from the DBIR, as we call it. So we've looked at 30,000 security incidents, out of which about 5,000 are confirmed data breaches. And what we've really found out based on our report is that ransomware is appearing in 1 in 10 of the breaches, which is more than double last year. 85% of the breaches are involving the human element, no surprises there. And then 36% phishing was present in 36% of the breaches in our data set. So this really talks about the enormity of the task that we are talking about here. And our report also highlighted that the attack on web applications continue to be high as the main attack vector in hacking actions. So with that, let's talk about the patterns. What are the key patterns? So what we tried to do here is to break the whole information in terms of patterns. And since the threat landscape continues to change, the new patterns will provide a clear framework as to for us to explain the threat landscape to our key stakeholders. So what we've tried to do is we have some patterns in breaches and some patterns in incident. And these patterns are explain 99% of the analyzed breaches and about 99.8% of the incidents over time. And we have retained denial of service, web application attacks, lost and stolen assets, privilege misuse, and everything else. And we've added some new patterns here, which you can see here, which is social engineering and system intrusion. This is in line with the emerging threat landscape and trying to give you a more holistic view of the emerging patterns. Now, as I said, we have contributors from across the globe, and these contributors have provided us specific insights into the regional cyber trends, highlighting the key similarities and the differences between them. So as I will move to the next few slides, you will see that the Asia-Pacific region is very unique in terms of the threat landscape, vis-a-vis Europe, Middle East, and Africa, and North America. So for the purpose of today's discussion, let's deep dive into the Asia-Pacific section. So, as we all know, our region covers an immense portion of the globe, and we have a multitude of nations, languages, diverse cultures, along with that, a fair share of threat actors. And in keeping with the diversity of our region, it shows a relatively wide range of industries that were breached last year. And the most common type of breaches that took place in Asia Pacific were caused by financially motivated actors, phishing employee for credentials, and then using those stolen credentials to gain access to the mail accounts and web application servers. So for the purpose of the report, we've looked at 5,000 incidents, out of which about 1,400 plus are confirmed data breaches. We have top patterns here, and social engineering, no surprises, tops there. The threat actors are primarily external threat actors, 95% of them. And then the motive for most of these threat actors is in 96% of the cases is financial. In 3% cases, it's espionage, and then fun, 1%. And what kind of data really gets compromised in these incidents or data breaches breaches is mostly credential data in 96% cases, and then personal data gets compromised in 3%, and then secrets in 1%. So as you can see, the Asia Pacific region again has a diverse range of industries that were breached. Most importantly, I would like to call out the mining industry. And this was due to the fact that organization in this vertical fell prey to a variety of social engineering attacks, and these credentials that were stolen were then used to escalate or laterally expand the social attack. So with that, let me move on to the next slide, which is more about the control. So we've seen the threat landscape is evolving, and different regions present different kinds of threats. So DBIR also highlights the security challenges and also suggests some kind of preventive controls that organization can look into. And we've looked at the Center for Internet Society controls, which are like recommendations and a set of best practices helping organization to prioritize their defense based on what the attackers are doing, the so-called informs defense strategy. So we are present. So let me share a few things from the CIS controls here. I'll be looking at top CIS controls implementation group 1, quickly talking about these 4 controls. The first and foremost, secure configuration of enterprise assets and software. So this is more about benefits towards reducing error-based breaches like misconfiguration and loss of substantial assets. Number 2, we look at account management. So this control is very much targeted towards helping organization manage their access to accounts and is useful against brute force and credential stuffing attack. The next one is more about access controls. It means organizations managing the right and privileges and enforcing multi-factor authentication on the key components of their environment. And last but not the least, and again, very, very important, is the importance of security awareness and skill training. And I think, as Ben said, it's everyone's responsibility. And it is obvious that awareness and technical training will really help us contributing towards a smart environment and support the teams against a world which is full of cognitive hazards. So with that, let me move to the next slide, which is more about the policy implications. Now that we've seen that the threat landscape is evolving and we need to be embracing and prepared to look at the relevant resultant policy intervention. So what the DBIR really helps us is to anticipate, predict, and better navigate the resultant policy interventions, as we see that there are more breaches than ever, and it sheds on the most common forms of cyber attacks that we as an information security industry are facing especially during a pandemic. So that really brings us to a question. With the threat landscape evolving, what kind of data will be regulated and to what extent, and what would be the breach reporting obligations? So what we see today is that policymakers are actually adopting different tools to deal with it, and rightfully so. And in Asia Pacific region, we have seen that a number of countries have enacted policies to address concerns from cybersecurity. And while the governments are rightfully doing so, concerned with the risk, they are adopting different approaches in dealing with it. And in some ways, they are creating burdensome obligations that are creating barriers to trade and investment. And the point that I wanted to emphasize here is that the compliance-focused regulatory models do not really create the flexibility for the businesses and the government to protect them. Ideally, the policies should recognize that the threat landscape is evolving. Therefore, the tools that we really need to confront them should also evolve. And so from a Verizon perspective, we believe that intelligence sharing, international best practices, and models such as the NIST cybersecurity framework are really a great starting point to start this conversation and help the organization to adopt the cybersecurity practices and procedures that are consistent with their business models and the relevant risks. And I think US-Singapore collaboration on cybersecurity is an excellent example of how the industry and the government can work together in sharing this common risk. I will quickly close out, as I know that Ben has given me an an indication. But we cannot close out without thanking our contributors who have given us their time, their expertise, and data to make this report a reality. And the contributors include security agencies from across the globe, including Cybersecurity Malaysia, Center for Internet Society, the CERT EU, and FBI, and JP CERT. So really, really thankful to these organizations for giving their quality time and data to make this report a reality. And with that, I'll finish my presentation. And back to you, Ben.
Thank you, Priya. That was very interesting. And thank you for really getting through a lot of very detailed information in a very short amount of time. So, of course, there's so much more that we want to dive into, which is why I'd like to spend this time of the Q&A to get more into the detail of some of the things that you mentioned, as well as some of the things that Andreas mentioned. And also, if you don't mind, we'll just have it as a comfortable three-way chat. And folks from Pacific Forum, feel free to jump in as well if you've got your own questions. And the audience, don't worry, I haven't forgotten you. You are still welcome to raise your hand, drop a question in the chat, drop a Q&A so that we can address something that you have, or if you want to jump in and say something, you're also welcome. And I recognize some friends among the audience. So if you have something, please do jump in. Otherwise, don't make me call on you. Yeah. So I'll let Priya have her coffee, and Andreas, since you've already had 15 minutes of to cool off, I wanted to get into the question, which is, as we look at the different things that Priya's been talking about, which are all the various threats that are happening, and the big threats, social engineering I see really high up there, phishing, by which through ransomware comes in. Then where does supply chain come in relation to that? How do we link up these things together?
Well, I think it's a good question. I think, what Priya was talking about are all elements that affect supply chains in different parts, right? So I think those are all, you think about, the different links in the supply chains. All those organizations could be subject to these types of attacks, could be subject to those type of data breaches. That's in part, and I'm actually really glad that Priya talked about the Center for Internet Security Controls, which is one of the tools that the organizations could address, in part to address their own cybersecurity. And they are part of a larger supply chain, which with potential mostly downstream, potential also upstream effects when there is a breach, right? That this is one of the tools that they could deploy to be a better partner in those in the running and helping make supply chains more resilient as well. And again, I think it was fairly interesting to hear Priya's conversation there. I also have some more questions for her. For one thing, I was kind of wondering why is the financial sector not more prominent in those statistics? I would have just assumed that maybe they do an excellent job, or maybe there are other reasons why we see less breaches there, which I think is something that has developed over time. But yeah, I hope I answered your question, Ben.
Yes, Andreas, which means that I then have to turn to Priya, who's had her coffee, so I don't feel so bad about asking her. Right. Andreas really mentioned the supply chain and how people are going to basically get in. They'll be using all of these tactics that you talked about at the contractors and the subcontractors, because it's difficult to hit the big guns. If you're a financial institution, you've probably got your banking system well locked down. But if you can hit the people who provide printing services, they may not be as secure and subject to the vulnerabilities. And the printing services look like they're stuck, right? I'm just using it as an example, because maybe they've got obligations, that contractual obligations from their customer to shore up the supply. If we're talking about like major organized crime or even state-sponsored attacks, what can a small business that's part of this supply chain do about it? And especially if you're in an Asian country, a smaller country, which is maybe not as developed as well, are they basically sitting ducks, or what can they do about it?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. I think that's an interesting question. And from a Verizon perspective, we've been thinking a lot about these issues and reflecting. And I can tell you from our perspective, and this is straight from our general counsel, who really did an interesting blog on this issue. So our approach is really simple. We think that the security of our networks is really serious, and as is the reliability and speed. And when a telco is building the network, it's important that we buy components only from trusted and long-time vendors who share really the same commitment to quality and security, right? So that's the first and foremost important thing. And then testing of the products and softwares that go into it. So we work to get those security commitments from all of our vendors, both large and small. So that's really our commitment to supply chain, and the current conversations about secure supply chain. And to me, whatever choices are made by an individual or a SME in a given country, we all must be prepared to operate in an environment where we will have equipments with different suppliers, as you said, right? And as Verizon, as an operator of a global network, we connect to many other companies' networks around the world, and some of them may have different response to supply chain threats. And that is why we specifically architect our networks to mitigate any of the risks that could arise from those connections. And we also realize that we don't always have the control or the choice of the devices that our customers may connect to at the periphery of our network. So we use features like a new tool that we use in 5G security that isolates the devices until they are fully authenticated to defeat any malicious activity at the network edge. So, this evolution towards a fully realized 5G environment will actually bring more security and more strong encryption, more defense at the edge, and greater potential for securing our environment. And we intend to leverage all these tools as the network develops.
Thanks, Priya. Then I have to get back to Andreas on this. So, do you think that this is something which should actually be driven by more regulation from the governments that get companies to require companies to do this? Right now, it's been a relatively soft touch by governments to suggest and recommend. Should this be then imposed, do you think, from a policy point of view on the smaller businesses, and then maybe some other measures that might help the smaller businesses to comply, maybe grants or something like that?
Well, that's a very good question. I think one of those long-standing questions, right, in this debate, how much government regulation is necessary, how effective could that be? I think the current thinking is, that industry does not prefer to be regulated on those things. At the same time, I think we see that there is certain things we know that should be done, and it's just not moving forward in the right direction. And could regulation help to that end, right? We have seen definitely regulation, for example, in the European with the NIS directive, kind of like to move forward with certain types of requirements that helps to that regard. But I think overall, I agree with you, right, that it's still overall pretty soft touch. And we see, different countries follow very different models when it comes to regulation overall, and that is also seen in regulation in cybersecurity in particular. When you think about China as an example, with very strict security requirements, the question is then, how is this actually implemented? This may be a slightly different question. Whether or not it's a good path to go is again a different question. I would not advocate for strict regulation throughout the board that are driven by governments, but there needs to be a conversation about that accountability, right? And from there, we should go down and see other particular sectors. Some of them are already regulated. You think about critical infrastructure sectors where governments have authorities to impose certain types of requirements. That might be a way to go without kind of concerns about overreaching regulation, because I think there still is this major concern about will more tech regulation lead to less innovation, right? So I think that's one of those concerns. But there, no doubt, there are good questions with regards to should governments do more when it comes to regulating the space. And I think when you think about all, broader conversation around beyond cybersecurity, when you think about content moderation, disinformation, I think there's definitely tendencies there to look to the government and seek guidance on those questions.
Andreas, you mentioned content regulation. We got to go there, at some point. Okay, but I noticed there are questions coming in the chat. So I've got one question in which I will get to because I'll wait for one or two more and see whether group them together. So just reminding everybody who's in the audience, just pop in your questions into the Q&A, don't feel shy. And so one of the things we're supposed to look at, right, are best practices. And Priya, you mentioned some of the controls, and you also mentioned that with 5G, you now can do things like isolate devices at the edge. And anything else that businesses can do, especially not at the scale of Verizon, because you're well protected, but what can people lower down the supply chain do?
Yeah, I mean, Ben, before I kind of go into the recommendation, I also want to just go back to something that Andreas just mentioned about the need for regulation. I think that's really important, a very important issue that's close to our heart. And what we are seeing, especially in the Asia Pacific region, we have a number of countries that have been enacting policies to address these concerns over cybersecurity, right? And as I said, in some cases, these may end up creating extremely burdensome requirements, and that would really act as a barrier to trade and investment. As Verizon, we really support an innovation-led approach, which is more about dealing with the cyber threats in the manner that the tools are in a line with the evolution of the cyber threat landscape. And from our perspective, I think intelligence sharing is one of the best things to do, which we do through these reports like data breach investigation report. So any small, medium, business enterprise can actually look at these reports and the recommendations and the controls that have been mentioned. And I really deep dive on the four main essential critical controls that are really important for any organization for any size. So I think that's the starting point of the conversation, by sharing intelligence about the emerging threat landscape. And number two is international best practices. I think we spoke about models such as NIST cybersecurity framework, which is a really great starting point. And what it really helps organizations of any sizes to assess where they are in that whole journey towards being more cyber resilient. Again, the last point I want to make here is, and this is more about approach to regulation, I think openness is a key to innovation and to productivity and to private investment, which in turn really fosters research. So collaboration between the government and industry is really, really critical to deal with the kind of issue that we are talking about here. Thanks.
Oh, thanks, Priya. That was very useful. And I think you have also raised an important keyword there, which is the openness and innovation. Because in the introduction to this talk, we did address the question of decoupling. And one of the big regulatory issues is that are certain countries' products or certain manufacturers in certain countries going to be excluded? What do both of you feel about the impact on innovation and also the ability for the competition to thrive in a situation like that, where there's always that fear that there's a fine line between this kind of regulation and protectionism?
I'd happy to go first if you want me to. Or Priya, if you want to go first.
I think she's nodding, yes.
Oh, okay, all right, excellent. Well, I think, that's a very difficult problem, and I think we need to kind of like take this further apart a little bit, right? As I said in my remarks, there might be, legitimate national security reasons why we would exclude a product or a vendor, but it comes at a certain economic cost for innovation. The fewer player in the field, the less competition, the less innovation. So the theory goes, right? And so I think that also comes down with the question of cybersecurity, right? So there is cybersecurity innovation. And I think there is, given we have a considerable cybersecurity problem, one could make an argument that actually more players would be better. And so the fact that we sometimes take players out might not necessarily lead to that the remaining players will invest and compete heavily on cybersecurity. And I think that's maybe something I want to go back to and maybe slightly revise my remark from before and maybe say something a little bit more controversial with regards to what Priya said, that there is a question whether or not industry does enough, invests enough in cybersecurity, and whether or not there is actually more regulation needed to push that to industry to do the right thing. And in part, the question there is, who is the actor that is most enabled to produce cybersecurity that is beneficial for all of us? And I think it is certain intermediaries for services can do that. In particular, industry is in a strategic position actually to move that forward. And I think there we have often very difficult dynamics going on, right? Why would a company invest in cybersecurity or participate in standard setting if then this is not part of the procurement requirement, for example, for supply chain security? So I think it comes back again around to those questions about implementation and what can we do when it comes to procurement to set the right incentives, for example, driven by governments to make those investments and adhere to those standards because they're part of a contractual agreement.
Thanks, Andreas. What do you think about that, Priya? You think it would help if the governments made it more necessary for businesses to go to Verizon and ask Verizon for more cybersecurity help?
Yeah, I think we are all ready to help our customers in their journey, and as more and more businesses are going digital, it's we are more than happy to help them. But I also want to kind of go back to something that Andreas just said about policy and whether there's need for more regulation. And I believe that regulation, as I've kind of just repeated, that more regulation really end up stifling innovation, and different approaches being taken. I'll take a classic example of Singapore, for example, where the cybersecurity agency has taken a more a prescriptive approach to regulating some industries like services like penetration testing and managed security operation centers. So, and compared to that, we have Australia, which is regulating more the critical infrastructure sector and what they term as systems of national significance. So we have different approaches emerging in the region. Policymakers applying different tools to deal with these issues. And as a global business and global security service providers, it becomes extremely burdensome and compliance ridden for companies like ourselves and a whole lot of other companies, including small and medium businesses, to comply with these set of requirements. So I think as a group, we also need to think about how we make it easy for the business to embrace some of these very well-intentioned policies, but at the same time looking at the compliance aspect as well.
Thanks, Priya. And does it mean you have a lot more openings in the compliance department? Just keeping it getting a little light on this. I did want to get onto a rather heavier topics, but before that, I thought that I'd address some of the questions in the chat. And here's a question from Priya. So I'm changing tack a little bit, right? Why is the arts, recreation, and entertainment the most commonly targeted sector? And for people who are not so familiar with cybersecurity, can you provide more details of what the human element is and social engineering? This sounds like it could be really interesting.
I think that's a good question. Why is the arts, recreation, and entertainment? I think all of us are spending more time on Netflix, isn't it? I am so glued and doing binge watching all the time. So I think the reason it's again linked to the impact of COVID-19, and that is the reason why this particular sector, the recreation entertainment industry, is the more targeted sector, because the bad actors are trying to profit from the pandemic, and they know where more of the people are spending their times. And then to the next question, for the uninitiated people who are not familiar with the human element, it involves the human beings at the center, error relating to human beings at the core of it. And by social engineering, it is, I mean, from a Verizon perspective and what we've covered in our report as well, it is typically attacks that are being done compromising psychological compromise of a person, which really alters their behavior into taking an action or breaching their confidentiality. And the system intrusion in turn then captures the complex attacks that leverage malware and other stuff. So social engineering is more about a psychological compromise of a person and then urging that person to take an action which may result in breaching the confidentiality.
Thanks, Priya, which brings us very neatly back to your Verizon report, which showed that social engineering is by far one of the best ways to get into a company. And this is from time immemorial, right? It's human beings. It's easier to breach a human than to breach a firewall. So
Yes.
it's with this in mind, then when we see countries trying to restrict products from other countries or restrict access from other countries, are we chasing the wrong risk? Are we raising the wrong problem? And Andreas, what do you think about that? Because social engineering doesn't require you to have somebody imported in a device with spyware on it. It's just a matter of maybe talking to somebody on the phone and convincing them that you're actually calling from HR or payroll or help desk.
That is absolutely right? So I think, those measures might have different motivations behind them, right? And so some of those measures, those restrictive measures I was talking about earlier, some of them might be based on cybersecurity reasons, right? But I think the longer we talk about that, it's what I've been referring to as the geopolitics of technology, where we maybe try to achieve other goals, right? In the case of China, for example, the conversation about reshaping semiconductors is in part, I would argue, certain states realize that having heavy reliance on foreign supply chains is a problem for them in the long term. There's one point you can make an argument around delaying 5G is one thing. I know we can live with that. Sorry, Priya, to say that, but not having access to semiconductors for a prolonged time would be a significant issue. And I think I just read yesterday a study. There was maybe it was the US, maybe I think it was the Commerce Department. I think they came out with a number that at this point some manufacturers have 5 days of reserve of semiconductors left. And so you can imagine if that breaks down, it would have a significant impact, devastating impact on the industry, because you would just have to stop. And I think that's what happened with the car industry, right? I think Toyota, if I'm not mistaken, they had to stop production because they were running out of semiconductors. And so this comes at tremendous costs. I think that's one part of the argument. The other part of the argument, and we can imagine why people do, or why politicians, policies do one or the other thing, is obviously also to curb China's tech ambition, right? That's the other part of that. I think at the end of the day, both play an important role. Whether or not those strategies in the long run will really pan out is a very different question. I think it also comes down to, different technology areas or sectors will work very differently when it comes to those questions. But when you think about semiconductor as one of the examples that I mentioned before, right? The U.S. is planning to spend $52 billion on enhancing its domestic semiconductor capacity, including research. I think India is planning to spend about $10 billion. The EU, I don't know the number there, but they are trying to boost their market share to 20% by 2030. So it's a huge effort behind that. But as we all know, this is an industry that is very capital intensive, has very long lead times. So and as we have seen with more recent market dynamics, like the leader Intel back in the days, has a hard time to, as far as I understand, producing cutting edge semiconductors at this point. So I think there is huge questions whether or not those strategies will, will result in the outcome that we're hoping for. I think time will tell.
Thanks, Andreas. That's very balanced, and I, of course, okay, Priya, I'm not going to ask you the geopolitical question. So still back with Andreas, what we've been talking about raises a couple of questions for me, because if we if we agree that it's good for states to not be over reliant on any single foreign source of technology, right? Because your resilience is necessary. You need to be able to back up. For example, if you find that all your natural gas is maybe coming from Russia, then you realize that if you have any dispute with Russia, they could cut off your natural gas. Then what should smaller countries who don't have a choice of ramping up their own domestic production do? And I realize that this is not something that ORF America remit to solve. But does anybody have any ideas? Because we've got a whole bunch of countries in, say, like ASEAN, who aren't able to produce their own semiconductors, aren't able to produce their own components. And part of the resilience strategy was to get products from both US and China. So to find the US and China having these disputes and trade disagreements is very worrying, because the Asian countries then might be put into a corner and have to choose either all US or all China, and correspondingly risk the huge amounts of trade that they are having with both the US and China. So I don't know whether there's any solution to this. What do you think?
I will tell you the solution in secret. I wish I would have a good answer. I think it's a tough problem, right? I think it's the situation of being caught in the middle between two big powers, with no clear forward, with also requests, I would say, from one or the other side to do one or the other thing, right? To reside with them. Prior to COVID-19, I would, broadly speaking, to the resilience question, I probably would have said something along the lines of like, well, draft your bilateral agreements on how you will help each other on certain issues, right? In terms of like supply shortages and resilience in that regard. But I think we have unfortunately seen during COVID-19 that global cooperation, even during a global pandemic, is not working really well. So I'm not sure if push comes to shove in a case where, say, you're running out of gas or semiconductors or whatever, and the other country you're partnering with is in a similar situation, that maybe those agreements will be honored. I'm not saying that's not possible, but I just raised the question that this is a difficult situation. So what can small countries do? I think you can try to work with your companies to build up maybe strategic resources, strategic reserves for certain things, right? To think ahead of the curve, to see what might be around the corner and do something along those lines. But in fact, it remains a difficult position to be in. Yeah.
Thanks, Andreas.
I'm actually curious. I'm actually, obviously, you're based in Singapore, Ben. I'm obviously curious to see how it looks like from your perspective, right? There is the point about talking about those policy and thinking about those policy issues when you're far away versus when you're the neighbor in those in some of those countries. What are practical solutions that, say, Singapore, for example, is currently considering, right? From a practical perspective, I recall conversation about the 5G, where Singapore telecommunication sectors turned down Chinese manufacturer, but at the same time, Singapore does use some Chinese technology for other parts of their digitalization strategy, right? And so I think there's probably somewhere a middle ground, but I'm just curious, what your thoughts on those developments are.
Well, that's a good turnaround, Andreas. So okay, first, if I want to clarify, it's not that the telecom industry in Singapore had turned down the Chinese 5G manufacturers, but in the process of doing the tenders, other companies happened to be chosen. There was no rejection of the Chinese 5G manufacturers, and those companies happen to be doing very well in Singapore anyway, on the consumer end, and also supplying other components that are in the homes of the people receiving telecom services from the Singapore telcos. So then the other part of it is that Singapore has always wanted to be in a balanced position, friend to all. And we are an open port, we are an open country. So it's been very important to be able to balance the relationships and to be able to trade with all parties. So it's really having that tightrope and walking it very carefully, and probably a lot of backroom discussion on, please don't make me choose. I think that there are going to be a lot of calculations that are being made and recalculated as time goes on. The world today, as you pointed out, is not the same as it was pre-2020. It's definitely not what it was in the 2010s or 2000s. So there are recalculations. If we look around the region, not just Singapore, there are ASEAN countries who, if they were asked to choose between US technology and Chinese technology, we can't guarantee which way they would choose. Because for some of them, if they want to choose where their bread is buttered on, Chinese technology might be the better idea. With the business that's going to come with it, the Chinese markets, the trade that they already have, and the price point. Because ASEAN countries really need the technology for the digital transformation of the economies. So it's also hoping that the US and Europe don't miscalculate and try to push ASEAN countries into a corner, because then they might go to the wrong direction from the viewpoint of the US and Europe. And
actually, when we are talking about ASEAN, I also wanted to share a very different perspective with both of you. And this is really connected to the ideas that Andreas, you and Ben, you shared about Singapore. And this is related to India. And what India has taken a completely different approach to this whole issue. And as a telecom provider, we know that India recently issued a National Telecom Security Directive. And as a part of that compliance framework, the idea is not to exclude vendors from some particular countries, but look at the supply chain in general and encourage the operators to kind of comply with some of the reporting requirements, which means that as a provider of telecom services, companies would be directed to apply for approvals before they induct any equipment in the network. And then as a part of that process, you then share who the vendor is or the original equipment manufacturer is, and the supply chain, which dates back to their parent company, and so on and so forth. So I think it's interesting to see that different countries in this ASEAN region are taking different approaches to this issue. And we don't really have a one-size-fit approach, what is right and what is wrong. But as Ben said, it's a very, very nuanced issue, and each country has its own, approach to kind of this particular issue. Thanks.
thanks, Priya. Actually, I'll probably follow up with you later to get more info about the Indian position, because that's always useful information for us. Yeah. I saw a question in the chat, in the Q&A, and I shouldn't forget, while we get too carried away in our own conversation, that as Mark Manhattan has a question which Crystal wants to answer live.
I'm just marking that we're going to answer it live.
Okay.
I don't want to answer it though.
Mark's question. Oh, God. Crystal, you're welcome to answer the question. Mark's question was, participation of private sector is crucial information sharing as demonstrated by Priya. Curious to ask both speakers, how do you cultivate an ecosystem of trust, especially among members of the private sector, to share any cyber attack disclosures given the growing demand for liability clauses in Southeast Asia against the backdrop of alarming incidents of data breaches and ransomware? Ah, I see. So some of the regulation actually is creating a chilling effect, perhaps. But I'm putting words into Mark's mouth. Mark, if I misrepresented you, you can jump in. But I'll throw it to Priya and Andreas.
I think what we are seeing, at least in this region, they are increased. The regulators are actually imposing mandatory data breach notification. In fact, Singapore recently did that. MAS for financial institutions has some mandates around that. And then we have other countries in this region like Australia where we already have a data breach notification. And to me, and the way I look at it, where there are sector specific requirements like for financial sector or the health sector, there the disclosures have to be made depending on the risk or harm or the number of users that get impacted, depending on the regulations of that particular sector. But other sectors which are not really as heavily regulated, it is up to the private sector and the government to create that system, nurture that system of trust and confidentiality where both the parties feel comfortable sharing the security incidents and the data breach information with each other.
Priya, before I bounce over to Andreas, do you think there's an issue? And I'm saying because I've spoken to many of my friends who are CISOs in the private sector, that on one hand, CISOs are worried to share what has happened because once you share something, you get sucked into this whole having to report and issue and do investigations and things because your regulator requires it. There's a whole bunch of compliance to do. Then on the other hand, there's government uh, certs who are reluctant to share because everything that arrives with them is confidential and classified. Do these kind of tensions make it difficult for information sharing?
Well, that's a great question, Ben. And again, there are different approaches. We do understand that some of the cert in different regions do send advisories to critical infrastructure providers. Okay, if they are aware of some kind of attack on the environment. So I think instead of tensions, we as providers, as internet providers or service providers, all of us have to think about how can we make this world more secure, more cyber resilient. And in that spirit, if we collaborate and share best practices, that's the ideal situation. And anything in between is something that we all need to work very closely and collaboratively. And that is why at Verizon, we have been requesting the governments, at least in this region, to be a contributor to the Verizon data breach investigation report, which is again a wealth of information providing action-enabled insights to the users about what kind of defense mechanisms they need to have in place to secure their systems.
That's a great plug. And well, it is a great report. So I am very happy to be able to have access to it as well. Actually, and what you mentioned about the world reminds me of the next question, which I had actually kept. But Andreas, do you have anything you wanted to put to that before I jump to the world?
Sure. Well, I think I agree with what Priya said. I think those are very good points. Operational information sharing is a challenge, and we still need to work on. Even though it seems like the topic that is always coming up, it seems not to be solved, and it seems to be so fundamental and so simple, and still it is not. But maybe it's a good point to maybe do a related point that I had in mind before, which is like, while we were saying regulation can hamper innovation, this type of regulation, seems to be just the right thing to do, right? It's like the safety belt in a car, right? If there would have no regulation, people wouldn't wear them, and so government comes in and does something that is a good thing. And in this case, you could also make an argument, at least as you know, Ben, from your lawyer friends, right? It's created an industry. So I know a regulation, and I think maybe we should make a point around smart regulation, and we should talk about how we could test regulation so it doesn't have unwelcome side effects that make things difficult. But I think regulation can be positive, or it should be positive. Maybe that's what we should strive for. And maybe as a last point on the regulation, I think, when you look forward for the next 10, 15 years, I think there will be more regulation in this space, whether businesses like it or not. They will have to adapt to that. And I think larger companies are much better in doing that. They have the resources. I'm much more worried about smaller companies that maybe want to go international or are in multiple markets. But I think just the fact when you look around how quickly the tech policy space has been growing just in the last 1 or 2 years. Kind of like things that popped up on the radars in terms of regulation from telecommunications policy, cybersecurity policy, social media regulation, disinformation. And I mean, the list does not seem to end. I think that's one of the critical points companies and people like you, Ben, and I need to work on.
Yes, there's definitely going to be more work. If anybody's watching this and based in Singapore, I'm hiring. Yeah. So speaking of people who are watching this, that question that came in from Facebook. Remember, I'm also on Facebook Live. So thanks, Crystal, for sharing this. Small businesses could be the weakest link in complex supply chains. Some governments have the means to provide cybersecurity as a service to help these businesses, but not all governments due to resource limitations, which, yeah, definitely in ASEAN, an issue. Is there a way for regional bodies to play a role to plug this gap partially, if not fully? Cybersecurity as a service provided by the region.
Yeah, I think, Ben, let me just quickly jump in here because we see some of those models, if not fully developing here in the region. For example, in my initial discussion, I spoke about the US-Singapore Joint Cybersecurity Working Group. And as part of that initiative, we also have the third country TCTP, third country training program, where we train the ASEAN officials in different models. And Verizon has been one of the contributors to that TCTP program. And I think that's an excellent model of how the two governments can collaborate and bring our folks from ASEAN, the governments who really work on those policies, to see how they can have a more meaningful engagement in the whole policy discussion. So that's one bit. I think AmCham Singapore plays a great role in kind of getting those discussions started. Again, Cybersecurity Agency, they organize a number of events and webinars to create awareness. So those are some of the initiatives that I am aware and Verizon has been a part of, which are really, to me, very good models of how we can all collaborate together and plug this gap.
Thanks, Priya. It does make me think, yes, these things like chambers of commerce could actually provide economies of scale to get cybersecurity as a service for their members. That's really a great idea. And Andreas, what do you think of the possibilities of regional help for this?
Well, I think that's definitely the way to go. When we think about from a UN perspective or regional security organizations, kind of the notion of capacity building in cybersecurity, it's a very hot topic, right? Since we're not necessarily able to make progress on other hot topics such as cyber norms, which we don't want to go into details here on this webinar, maybe another one. But I think cyber capacity building is a very important part, particularly for countries maybe less digitally developed to get maybe some of those supports that they're needed. I think there's quite a bit of effort underway. The question remains, do the right countries get the type of capacity building that they actually need? I think there's still questions around what's called donor coordination that need to be answered, but I think it's the way to go for cybersecurity in general, but also for supply chain security specifically. How can smaller countries deal with some of those really complex issues? And the same applies for obviously businesses. And you think about chambers of commerce. You think about the roles that certs could play in something like this. There are regional certs. I'm not familiar to what degree they actually provide more wide-ranging cybersecurity services, but some form of a shared service center that provides cybersecurity services, I think, would be very helpful and a meaningful investment to pursue.
And I'm not doing a sales pitch here, Ben, but Verizon is a provider of security solutions. And we do help not only large enterprises, but small, medium businesses to kind of with their needs and solutions. So happy to facilitate a conversation with our folks, specialists, if that's kind of something someone is interested in. Yeah.
Absolutely, Priya. We've got good help to provide. Don't be shy. Yeah. So we're happy to, everybody, if you want to contact Priya, just say hi to her, put something in the Q&A, message her. This is Andreas, we really don't really want to go deep into the cyber norms discussion this time. So maybe we can organize some other roundtable or workshop around this. This every meeting's an opportunity to plan the next webinar, right? Right. Thanks, thanks, Crystal. So, but I am curious, right? From a big, cybersecurity business like enterprise like Verizon, what do you think of the UN processes and how they've been moving along, shall we say? And do you think they are, doing enough, doing anything to help at the enterprise level, or you're just waiting and seeing?
Yeah, so Ben, I'm not following very closely the UN developments, but based on my limited information, I think this again calls for a multilateral approach, not a bilateral approach, which is limited to a particular country or a region. So I believe this is a problem to which there should only be a multilateral solution, and engagements like this, webinars like this, are really a great starting point where we have folks from across the globe participating in a discussion and informing and evolving our approach to this issue. Thanks.
Wow, that's a great way to end off the whole event. And I'll just, before I hand back over to Crystal for closing remarks, maybe a final thing from Andreas and a final thing from Priya.
Well, go ahead, please.
No, I think from my perspective, I hope you found the data breach investigation report very helpful. I'm happy to have a conversation and a discussion. At the same time, if we have policymakers or government folks on the call, please feel free to come forward and be a contributor to the report. That would really make this report more rich and the content useful to our readers. Thank you.
Thanks, Priya. Yes, government folks in the chat, please contact Priya. Andreas.
Well, from my end, I want to say thank you again for having me here. It was a wonderful conversation. Thank you, Ben, for moderating it, and thank you, Priya, for providing, I think, a very important industry perspectives. I think it's important to kind of like, I know we don't have found the middle ground on like the innovation versus regulation question, but I think those are key questions that moving forward we need to address in order to get cybersecurity and cyber resilience where it should be in the 21st century.
Thank you, Andreas. Yes, we should have more webinars and more papers. So thank you very much, Crystal, for having invited us all to this. I hand it back to you.
Thanks so much, Ben, for your excellent moderation as always. And thanks so much to the speakers for two really great talks and also really rich discussion. I will note, and Ben knows this, but last series sponsored by the US Embassy Singapore, we did do quite a long discussion on cyber norms. So we can always retap that. I think there's a lot of ground always to cover on that topic. But again, thank you to the speakers, moderator, and also participants for taking time out of your day to join us today. I was going to run one additional poll, but we're running a little short on time, so I don't want to keep everyone. But I do just want to express my hope that you'll continue to stay engaged with us at Pacific Forum. You can find out more about us and our programs at www.pacforum.org. We plan to hold the fourth session of this series next month. The topic will be advancing digital solutions, and we're going to be exploring renewable energy, sustainability, climate change, and smart cities. So please stay tuned for more details by subscribing to Pacific Forum or following us on social media. I'd also like to remind you of the post-event survey, which we'll share again in the chat box now. We would really appreciate if you would just take a few minutes of your time left in your day to complete it and to share your feedback with us so we can make sure that we keep these sessions as engaging and productive for everyone as possible. So thanks one more time to the panelists and participants for joining us today, making discussion so rich, informative, and engaging. And we hope that we'll see you at the future events in these series. Thank you.